Between 1956 and 2005, the United States built more than 1,500 enclosed shopping malls, the largest peacetime construction project in human history. They poured over 2 billion square feet of retail space across the American landscape, enough floor area to cover the island of Manhattan twice. At their peak in the late 1990s, these malls generated over $300 billion in annual sales and employed more than 5 million people. Today, more than 400 of them are dead. Not closed for renovation, not repurposed, dead. Their parking lots cracked and overgrown, their fountains dry, their anchor stores hollow shells where pigeons roost in the food courts and rainwater pools on the terrazzo floors. They are the largest ruins of the 21st century, and they are everywhere, and almost nobody talks about the fact that they were supposed to be something completely different from what they became. The shopping mall was invented by a man who hated what it turned into. Victor Gruen was born Victor David Grunbaum in Vienna in 1903. He grew up in the 6th District, a neighborhood where the coffee house, the butcher, the bookshop, the tailor, and the public garden were all within a 5-minute walk. His mother ran a small business. His father was a lawyer. The family was Jewish, secular, and deeply embedded in the social life of a city where daily existence happened on foot. Gruen trained as an architect at the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, the same school that had twice rejected Adolf Hitler, and worked in the city's theater scene, designing sets and storefronts that borrowed techniques from cabaret and expressionist drama. Angled mirrors, dramatic spotlights, theatrical curtains that turned a shop window into a stage. When Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany in 1938, Gruen fled. He arrived in New York with $8 in his pocket, no English, and a set of design instincts shaped by a European city that would be systematically destroyed over the next 7 years. Within a decade, Gruen had reinvented American retail design. His early storefronts on Fifth Avenue used open facades that eliminated the barrier between the sidewalk and the store interior, drawing pedestrians inside with techniques that felt organic but were precisely engineered. The stores were small, clever, and profitable. But Gruen had a larger vision. He had grown up in a city where human connection was built into the physical environment, where the density of streets, the proximity of shops, and the presence of public squares made social interaction unavoidable. America had nothing like this. American cities in the 1940s and 1950s were being hollowed out by the automobile and the suburb, their downtowns hemorrhaging residents and businesses to the expanding ring of single-family houses and highway interchanges that spread outward from every metropolitan center. The suburbs had houses, schools, and churches, but they had no center, no public square, no place where strangers encountered each other as a matter of daily life. Gruen believed he could build one. His concept was not a shopping center, it was a new kind of civic space. Gruen's original plans for Southdale Center in Edina, Minnesota, the first fully enclosed, climate-controlled shopping mall in the United States, which opened on October 8, 1956, included apartments, offices, a medical clinic, a school, a park with walking trails, and a community auditorium surrounding the retail core. The retail component would generate the revenue to subsidize the civic functions, creating a self-sustaining community center that replicated the social density of a Viennese neighborhood within the sprawl of post-war American suburbia. The central court was designed as an indoor garden with trees, sculptures, a cafe, and a goldfish pond. It was heated in winter and cooled in summer, providing a public gathering space that Minnesota's climate would otherwise make impossible for 6 months of the year. The ceiling was 72 feet high. The garden court was bathed in daylight from clear-story windows. It was, in Gruen's vision, a piazza, not a store. What actually got built was the retail core and nothing else. The developers who financed Southdale, the Dayton Company, a Minneapolis department store chain, stripped out every civic function from Gruen's plan and kept only the stores. They did this because stores generated rent and community centers did not. The logic was irrefutable and, to Gruen, devastating. Southdale opened with 72 stores, 2 anchor department stores, Donaldson's and Dayton's, an indoor garden court, and none of the apartments, offices, clinics, schools, or parks that Gruen had designed. The garden court survived because it was beautiful and attracted foot traffic. Everything else that did not directly produce revenue was eliminated. The building was a commercial success from day one. Shoppers loved the climate control, the convenience, the variety, and the novelty of an indoor space that felt like an outdoor plaza. The architecture trade press praised the design. Developers across the country noticed. Within 3 years, enclosed malls were under construction in 17 states. Gruen spent the rest of his career watching his inventions spread across the country in a form he considered a grotesque distortion of his original vision. By 1978, when he returned to Vienna permanently, Gruen was openly calling American shopping malls ugly and disastrous, and disavowing any responsibility for what they had become. He compared himself to Victor Frankenstein, a creator who had lost control of his creation. He died in 1980, having witnessed the construction of roughly 1,200 enclosed malls in the United States, none of which included the civic components he had originally designed. The term Gruen transfer entered the vocabulary of retail psychology. It describes the moment when a purposeful shopper, disoriented by the mall's layout, transitions into an aimless browser who makes unplanned purchases. It was named after a man whose entire career had been devoted to the opposite goal, turning aimless consumers into purposeful citizens. The mall that the developers built, the one that actually spread, was not a community center. It was a machine. The design followed a formula so consistent that a person blindfolded and dropped into any American mall built between 1965 and 1995 would have been unable to identify the city, the state, or even the region. 2 levels, occasionally 3. Anchor department stores at each end, Sears, JCPenney, Macy's, Dillard's, connected by corridors of smaller specialty shops. A food court near the center, typically on the upper level, featuring a predictable rotation of Chinese takeout, pizza, pretzels, and a Sbarro or an Orange Julius. Skylights every 50 feet, fake plants in ceramic pots, a fountain with pennies in it, Muzak piped through ceiling speakers, terrazzo or tile flooring in neutral tones that showed dirt slowly. The formula was not arbitrary. Every element was engineered to maximize the time a customer spent inside the building, a metric the industry called dwell time. The corridors were designed without straight sight lines so that shoppers would be forced past storefronts rather than walking directly to their destination. The absence of windows eliminated any sense of time passing. The climate control maintained a constant 72 degrees regardless of the weather outside, making the act of leaving feel like a physical punishment, stepping from conditioned air into August humidity or January wind. The mall was a behavioral trap disguised as architecture, and for 40 years it worked perfectly. The economics that drove mall construction were as formulaic as the architecture. A developer would identify a suburb with growing population, purchase a large parcel of cheap land near a highway interchange, typically 40 to 80 acres, enough for the building plus the parking lots that surrounded it like a moat, and approach 2 or 3 department store chains to serve as anchor tenants. The anchors typically paid little or no rent, and in some cases received cash contributions from the developer toward their construction costs. Their function was not to generate direct rental income. Their function was to generate foot traffic that would flow past the smaller inline stores, which paid premium rents, often $40 to $80 per square foot per year in the 1980s and 1990s, for the privilege of being located between the anchors. The inline tenants subsidized the anchors subsidized the foot traffic subsidized the rents. The system was circular, self-reinforcing, and entirely dependent on one assumption, that the anchors would survive. The assumption held for decades. Between 1960 and 2000, the number of enclosed malls in the United States grew from fewer than 100 to more than 1,500. The construction followed the suburbs, which followed the highways, which followed the federal money. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956, signed into law by President Eisenhower in the same year Southdale opened, allocated $25 billion for the construction of 41,000 miles of limited-access highways that connected every major metropolitan area in the country. The highways made suburban living possible by reducing commute times from hours to minutes. Suburban living created demand for suburban retail, and suburban retail meant malls. The relationship was so direct that real estate developers referred to highway interchanges as golden corners, the four quadrants of land surrounding a highway exit, each one a potential mall site. By the mid-1980s, new mall openings were averaging 140 per year. The United States had more shopping center square footage per capita than any nation in history, roughly 24 square feet for every man, woman, and child in the country. The next closest nation, Canada, had 6. The gap was not a measurement of consumer demand. It was a measurement of overbuilding, and nobody at the time called it that. The malls were not just stores. For a generation of American teenagers in the 1980s and 1990s, they were the primary social space outside of school and home. The phenomenon was so widespread that sociologists coined the term mall rat to describe adolescents who spent their afternoons and weekends wandering the corridors without buying anything, or buying very little, a slice of pizza and a soda that served as the admission price to a climate-controlled social club. The mall provided what the suburb conspicuously did not: a public space with other people in it. It was air-conditioned in summer, heated in winter, safe from traffic, patrolled by security guards, and free to enter. Parents dropped their children off at the mall entrance the way an earlier generation had dropped them off at the park or the community pool. The fact that the space was privately owned and commercially motivated was irrelevant to the teenagers who used it. For them, the food court was the town square. The arcade, Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter II, air hockey tables, was the clubhouse. Spencer Gifts was the museum of the absurd. The record store was the library. The mall was, in a deeply ironic way, the civic center that Victor Gruen had originally designed, except that the civic function was an accident, not a feature, and the people who owned the mall were actively trying to figure out how to charge for it. The mall also served a function that almost no one discussed openly. It was the last indoor public space in the American suburb that did not require membership, a ticket, or a purchase for entry. Libraries were the other candidate, but libraries were quiet, small, and programmatically limited. The mall was loud, vast, and anarchically diverse. On a Saturday afternoon in a mid-market American mall in 1993, you could see retirees walking laps for exercise, teenagers flirting in the food court, families with strollers examining shoes, military recruiters staffing a kiosk near the main entrance, a portrait photographer working out of a storefront, and a man in a suit selling timeshares next to the Sears automotive entrance. No other building type in American life accommodated this range of human activity under one roof. The mall was the closest thing the post-war American suburb had to a public commons, and it existed entirely by accident. The system began to fail in the late 1990s, and the failure followed the same formula in every city. The first sign was always the departure of an anchor tenant. When Sears or JCPenney or Macy's or Dillard's closed a location, and they began closing locations by the dozens in the early 2000s, the effect was not proportional to the anchor's share of the mall's retail space. It was catastrophic. The anchor's absence removed the foot traffic that the inline stores depended on for survival. Within months, the smaller stores began to close. The closures reduced foot traffic further, triggering more closures in a cascading sequence that mall managers called the death spiral. The remaining tenants negotiated rent reductions, shortened their lease terms, or broke their leases entirely and paid the early termination penalties, which were cheaper than operating a store with no customers. The developer, facing declining revenue, deferred maintenance, the fountains stopped running, the skylights developed leaks that were patched with buckets rather than repaired, the escalators broke and were blocked off with plywood and orange cones. The deferred maintenance made the mall less attractive to the remaining shoppers, which accelerated the exodus of tenants, which further reduced revenue, which led to more deferred maintenance. The spiral was self-reinforcing, and once it began, almost nothing could stop it. The proximate causes of the anchor departures varied, but the underlying pattern was the same. The department store model was dying. Sears, which had been the largest retailer in America for most of the 20th century, began its terminal decline in the 1980s when it failed to adapt to competition from Walmart and Target, discount chains that operated from standalone big-box stores near highway exits rather than from expensive anchor positions inside enclosed malls. Sears had built its empire on the catalog business and the post-war suburban expansion. When both of those advantages eroded, the catalog killed by the internet, the suburban monopoly broken by big-box competition, Sears had nothing left. JCPenney and Macy's were weakened by the same competitive pressure and by their own strategic blunders. JCPenney's disastrous 2012 rebranding under CEO Ron Johnson, which eliminated sales and coupons, drove away the company's core customers and cost it $4 billion in revenue in a single year. Nordstrom and Neiman Marcus retreated to upscale locations and abandoned mid-market malls entirely. The department store model, a large, multi-category store that served as a destination in its own right, was being dismantled from every direction by specialist retailers that did one thing cheaper or better. Best Buy sold electronics more efficiently than the department store's electronics section. Old Navy sold casual clothing at prices that Sears could not match. Home Depot sold tools and hardware in a warehouse format that made the department store's hardware aisle look like a toy display. The anchors were not closing because the malls were failing. The malls were failing because the anchors were closing. The distinction matters because it means the problem was not architectural, it was structural. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 2002, the United States had approximately 1,500 enclosed shopping malls. By 2010, the number functioning at healthy occupancy had dropped below 1,100. By 2015, it was below 900. Sears, which had operated as an anchor in more than 700 malls at its peak, filed for bankruptcy in 2018 and closed all but a handful of locations. JCPenney filed for bankruptcy in 2020 and closed 200 stores. Macy's announced in 2020 that it would close 125 locations over 3 years. Each anchor closure sent the same shockwave through the same vulnerable system. The inline stores lost their traffic, the developer lost rental income, the maintenance budget was slashed, and the spiral began. In some cases, the entire progression from healthy mall to abandoned shell took less than 5 years. The speed of the collapse was itself a revelation about how fragile the system had always been. The malls looked permanent. They were designed to look permanent. The terrazzo, the brass railings, the marble-clad columns in the anchor stores. But the permanence was cosmetic. Underneath, the entire structure depended on a set of economic relationships that could unravel in a single quarter. Then came the force that ensured none of the dead malls would ever come back. Amazon was founded by Jeff Bezos in his garage in Bellevue, Washington in 1994. It began selling books in 1995, expanded into general merchandise by 2000, introduced Prime 2-day shipping in 2005, and by 2020 had captured roughly 40% of all online retail sales in the United States. The effect on mall retail was not immediate, but it was terminal. Amazon did not compete with malls the way Walmart did, by offering lower prices in a physical location nearby. Amazon competed by eliminating the need for a physical location entirely. A shopper who could buy anything from a phone at midnight and have it delivered to her door within 48 hours had no reason to drive to a mall, find parking in a lot the size of a wheat field, walk past stores she did not need, wait in line, and carry her purchases back to her car. The convenience gap between online retail and mall retail widened every year, and the malls had no way to close it. They were buildings designed for an era when purchasing required physical presence. That era ended sometime around 2010, and the buildings remained. The death of a mall follows a recognizable sequence, as predictable and as melancholy as the stages of a terminal illness. Phase 1. The anchor closure. One or two large stores go dark. Their logos are removed from the exterior signage, leaving rectangular shadows on the facade where the letters block the sun's bleaching effect. The mall management replaces them with temporary tenants, Halloween costume shops that appear in September and vanish by November, furniture liquidators advertising "Everything must go" on banners draped across empty department store entrances, tax preparation services that occupy 800 square feet of a 120,000 square foot anchor box. Phase 2, the Cascade. The inline stores begin to close, one by one, then in clusters. The food court shrinks from 12 restaurants to 5, then to 2. Always the last two are a Chinese place and a Subway. The corridors that once felt crowded on a Saturday afternoon are now empty at noon on any day of the week. Phase 3, the holdouts. A nail salon, a phone repair shop, a dollar store, and a military recruiting office operate from scattered locations across a building designed to hold 150 businesses. The parking lot is 90% empty. Security guards, sometimes one, sometimes none, patrol corridors where half the overhead lights have been turned off to save electricity. The Muzak has been turned off. The fountain has been drained. Phase 4, closure. The owner, often by now a real estate investment trust that purchased the property at auction for a fraction of its original development cost, boards the entrances, chains the doors, and walks away. The building sits. Property taxes may or may not be paid. Vandals enter through broken windows or loading dock doors. Copper thieves strip the wiring. Water damage spreads from the roof through the ceiling tiles to the floors. The structure, designed to be climate-controlled at 72 degrees at all times, deteriorates with stunning speed once the HVAC system shuts down. Mold colonizes the drywall. The dropped ceiling panels sag, then fall. The terrazzo cracks. The scale of the abandonment is difficult to grasp without numbers. As of 2025, researchers at commercial real estate firms estimate that between 400 and 500 enclosed malls in the United States are either dead or dying. Dead meaning less than 10% occupancy. Dying meaning the trajectory is clear and the remaining tenants are operating on month-to-month leases with no expectation of renewal. The dead malls are not concentrated in any one region. They span the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt, wealthy suburbs and poor ones, growing cities and shrinking ones. Randall Park Mall in North Randall, Ohio, once the largest mall in the world when it opened in 1976, with 2.2 million square feet and 200 stores, closed in 2009 and was demolished in 2014. Its site is now an Amazon fulfillment center. The symmetry is so perfect it reads like fiction. Owings Mills Mall in Owings Mills, Maryland, closed in 2016 after losing all 4 anchor tenants. Rolling Acres Mall in Akron, Ohio, sat abandoned for a decade, its skylights shattered, its corridors flooded, before it was finally demolished in 2017. Metcalf South in Overland Park, Kansas. Crestwood Court in Crestwood, Missouri. Northgate Mall in Durham, North Carolina. The list extends into the hundreds, and each entry represents a building that cost tens of millions of dollars to construct and that now generates exactly 0 economic value. Some malls have been repurposed, and the repurposing attempts range from inspired to absurd. The most common conversion is to mixed-use development, apartments, offices, medical facilities, and a reduced amount of retail combined in a single complex that functions more like a small town than a shopping center. This is, in a dark irony that Victor Gruen would have appreciated, approximately what he proposed in 1956 and was told was impractical. Other malls have been converted to churches, call centers, community colleges, indoor go-kart tracks, self-storage facilities, and data centers. In Austin, Texas, the Highland Mall was converted into the Austin Community College Highland campus, its department store shells transformed into classrooms and computer labs. In Providence, Rhode Island, the Westminster Arcade, the oldest indoor shopping center in America, built in 1828 with a Greek Revival granite facade, was converted into micro-apartments on the upper floor with retail below. In Minneapolis, the Mall of America, the largest in the country at 5.6 million square feet, survives by functioning as a tourist destination rather than a local shopping center. Its Nickelodeon Universe theme park, Sea Life Aquarium, and 520 stores draw 40 million visitors annually, many of whom travel from out of state specifically to visit the mall. It is the exception that proves the rule, because its survival depends on being unique, and the defining characteristic of the American mall was that none of them were unique. But for every mall that has been successfully converted, dozens sit empty and unresolvable. The economics of conversion are punishing. A dead mall is not just an empty building. It is an empty building specifically designed for one purpose: the display and sale of consumer goods, and that actively resists every attempt to use it for something else. The ceiling heights are wrong for residential conversion. The floor plates are too deep for office use. The interior is so far from any exterior wall that natural light cannot reach it, making it unsuitable for any occupancy that requires windows. The parking lots, which typically cover 3 to 5 times the footprint of the building itself, are too large to maintain and too expensive to demolish. The HVAC systems are proprietary, aging, and designed for the thermal load of a packed retail environment, not the steady climate needs of an apartment building. The structural layout, long corridors connecting large, column-free anchor boxes, does not correspond to any other building type's spatial requirements. Demolition is often cheaper than renovation, but demolition of a structure that covers 1 million square feet or more generates hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete, steel, and construction debris, and the cost of hauling, processing, and disposing that volume of waste material can exceed the value of the cleared land, particularly in suburbs where land prices have declined since the mall's closure. The visual character of a dead mall is unlike any other category of American ruin. A dead factory has an honesty to its decay: exposed brick, broken glass, rust, the raw materials of industrial labor visible in the building's bones. A dead house has a scale that the human eye can comprehend and a pathos that is immediate and personal. But a dead mall combines the sheer physical scale of an industrial structure with the false domesticity of a retail interior designed to feel cozy, and the result is profoundly uncanny. The fountains are still there, but dry, their basins stained with mineral deposits and scattered with debris. The illuminated directories are still mounted on the walls, their backlit maps showing the locations of stores, Claire's, Walden Books, Radio Shack, Foot Locker, that closed 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. The food court tables are still bolted to the floor in rows, their laminate surfaces peeling. The skylights still let in gray light that falls on empty corridors where the potted ficus trees have been dead so long they have turned to gray stalks of dried cellulose. The space was designed, at enormous expense and with considerable skill, to feel welcoming, and the residue of that design intention persists even in advanced decay. Walking through a dead mall is not like walking through a ruin. It is like walking through a memory, a space that is still, at some architectural level, trying to be something it can no longer be. There is a large and growing community of people who explore and document dead malls. They photograph the empty corridors, the defunct escalators, the peeling food court signage, and post the images online, where they generate millions of views. The appeal is partly aesthetic. The images of vast, skylit, abandoned retail spaces have a melancholy grandeur that photographs extremely well, particularly in the golden hour light that falls through broken skylights. And partly archaeological. A dead mall preserves a specific moment in American commercial and social history with a completeness that no museum exhibit can match. The tile patterns, the font choices on the remaining signage, the escalator models, the food court layout, the particular shade of mauve that dominated mall interiors from 1985 to 1995. All of it is a record of how a specific generation of Americans shopped, ate, socialized, dated, got their first jobs, and spent their leisure time. A dead mall is a time capsule, and the time it captures, the last decades of the 20th century, is now far enough in the past to feel historical and close enough to feel personal. The teenagers who spent their Saturday afternoons in these corridors in 1994 are now in their 40s and 50s, and when they see photographs of the mall where they had their first date, or bought their first album, or worked their first job at the Cinnabon, the nostalgia is immediate and physical. The Dead Mall has become one of the defining visual symbols of millennial and Gen X memory, a monument to a version of American life that felt normal at the time and now feels as distant as a daguerreotype. The environmental cost of the dead malls is rarely discussed, but staggering. Each enclosed mall sits on 40 to 100 acres of land that was, in most cases, farmland or forest before it was paved. The parking lots alone, typically covering 3 to 5 times the footprint of the building, represent hundreds of thousands of square feet of impervious surface that generates stormwater runoff, contributes to urban heat island effects, and cannot support any form of biological life. The buildings themselves contain thousands of tons of concrete, steel, glass, aluminum, and synthetic materials that will remain on the site indefinitely unless demolished at enormous expense. The refrigerant in the HVAC systems, often older formulations with high global warming potential, leaks slowly from abandoned equipment. The underground fuel tanks at the automotive service centers attached to Sears and Montgomery Ward locations pose contamination risks that can complicate redevelopment for decades. A dead mall is not just an economic failure, it is an environmental burden that the land will bear long after the last store closes. There is one more dimension to the dead mall phenomenon that deserves attention, because it reveals something about the nature of American real estate development that applies far beyond retail. The malls were not built to last. They were built to generate returns over a 20 to 30-year horizon, after which the developer expected to sell the property, refinance, or redevelop. The construction quality reflected this expectation. The structural steel was adequate but not over-engineered. The facades were prefabricated panels, not masonry. The roofing systems were flat membranes with 20-year warranties, not pitched roofs designed for centuries of service. The interior finishes, the terrazzo, the brass, the marble veneer, were chosen to signal quality to consumers, not to endure generations of use. When a mall reaches the end of its designed lifespan and its economic model has collapsed, there is no reason to maintain it and no structural reserve to sustain it through a period of disuse. The building begins to fail almost immediately after the last tenant leaves. A medieval cathedral can stand empty for centuries and remain structurally sound. A 1985 shopping mall cannot stand empty for a decade without the roof failing. The dead mall is not just a commercial failure. It is a physical manifestation of a building philosophy that treated architecture as a disposable commodity, something to be used, depleted, and discarded, like the consumer goods it was built to sell. The story the dead malls tell is not flattering. The American shopping mall was a building type that consumed farmland at a rate of 40 to 80 acres per installation, replaced authentic public space with privately controlled commercial space, organized human movement around the single imperative of purchasing, and collapsed the moment the economic assumptions behind it shifted by a few degrees. It was designed, in Victor Gruen's original vision, to be the center of community life, and it became instead a machine for extracting retail profit from the isolation of suburban existence. When the machine broke, the communities it was supposed to serve discovered that they had no alternative gathering place. The mall had replaced the downtown. The downtown had been left to decay. And when the mall itself began to decay, there was nothing behind it, just parking lots stretching to the highway ramp, and a growing sense that something that had seemed permanent was, in fact, as temporary as the consumer culture that built it. Victor Gruen understood this before anyone else. In a 1978 speech delivered to a planning conference in London, shortly before his final return to Vienna and 2 years before his death, he described American malls as bastard developments that had destroyed the urban environment they were supposed to enhance. He blamed the developers, not the design. His original vision, a mixed-use civic center with housing, offices, parks, and community facilities wrapped around a retail core, had been viable, he argued. What killed it was the decision to strip out everything that did not generate immediate revenue and build only the stores. That decision turned the mall into a single-function building with no fallback purpose, a structure that could not survive the loss of the one function it was designed to perform. Whether Gruen was right about his own design is a question that cannot be answered, because his design was never built. What was built was something else, and that something else produced the largest collection of abandoned structures in the modern world. Drive past one on a Tuesday afternoon and see for yourself. The parking lot will be empty except for a handful of cars clustered near the one entrance that has not yet been chained shut. The JCPenney sign will still be mounted on the facade, its red letters faded to a pale orange by 20 years of sun exposure. The automatic doors will open onto a corridor that smells of floor wax and stale air, and the particular institutional staleness that accumulates in buildings where the ventilation circulates the same air endlessly because no one has opened a window since 1974. A security guard will be sitting in a folding chair near the management office, watching a video on his phone. The only sound will be the hum of the HVAC system, still running in a building that has almost nothing left to heat or cool. Somewhere in the food court, a single fluorescent tube will be flickering in a ceiling fixture, designed to illuminate a bustling lunch rush that stopped happening a decade ago. The mall is not dead yet, technically. It is dying, in the way that buildings die, slowly, silently, by the withdrawal of the human activity that gave the space its meaning. And when it finally closes, the building will sit for years, perhaps decades, because nobody in this country has yet figured out what to do with 1 million square feet of climate-controlled emptiness sitting in a suburb that was planned, financed, and built around the foundational assumption that the mall would always be there. The assumption was wrong. The suburb remains, the mall does not. And nobody, not in 1956, not in 1985, not in 2005, planned for what would happen after the anchor left and the lights went out and the fountains ran dry and the largest peacetime construction project in human history became the largest collection of ruins.